So the next thing we want to do is get the profile data for a particular user. So recall from last time from version 1 that if you want to visit localhost /user/Philip, it should find the data corresponding to Philip, Carol, so forth, and valid username, it should find nothing. So the first thing we want to do is get the name of the person we want to look up from the request object. So this req params user ID was the name that you want to look up, because this user ID is right here, is a kind of a pseudo variable in the URL, like a template variable, and then here is how you get it out. And everything else uses like a fake database that we really don't want. So let's just remove this old code. I'm going to keep this as comments just for reference. Okay, so once again, we want to figure out how to do this with our SQLite database called pets.db. So to do this, we're going to once again use db.all. So db.all, we're going to run this. Now there's a little bit more to write, so I want to separate on separate lines. So the query is going to be select star from users to pets where name equals $name. Okay, so this is the SQL query. It says select all the fields or all the columns from the users to pets table, but I want to only select those columns where the name field matches a $name variable I'm going to pass in. So I'm going to filter by the name. The second parameter to db.all is an object that contains the mapping for $name. So notice how this $name should match with this $name. Those two should match each other. And if you feel that the $sign looks funny in front of variable name, it's actually not weird. It's because JavaScript allows you to have variable names that start with the $sign. It's a legal identifier. So in the SQLite interface of JavaScript, they often use these $signs to denote these template variables that you're going to pass in. So what am I going to use for name? I'm going to use name to look up, because name to look up is this thing above that came from the URL. So when I call this when I visit localhost 3000 users Philip, name to look up will be Philip, and this $name we're going to pass into the string, the SQL command will be Philip. So if I call this with Philip, it should say select star from users to pets where name equals Philip. And if it's Carol, it'll say where name equals Carol, or where name equals invalid username, or whatever you pass in. Okay, so let's close up this object here. So this is an object with one key value binding, $name to name to look up. And that's just because we only had one $name up here. You can imagine several different objects that you pass, several different parameters you pass in through this object. Okay, so the first thing is the SQL query. Second thing is the parameters to pass into SQL query. And the third thing is the callback function to run when the query finishes. So this callback function again takes ERR and rows, takes two parameters. I'm going to have to end some parentheses. So we're going to take two parameters. So that's where the callback function ends. And this is where the db.all call ends. So it's pretty nested. But this callback function, once again, it's a function to run after this query finishes. Okay, so what do we want to do? First, just for starters, let's just console.log rows, just so we can have a sanity check. It's always a good idea to console log things just so you can check, see if they're working as expected. Okay, so now let's try to visit these URLs. Let's try to visit the Philip one first. Okay, so if I go like this, I'm going to visit Philip. And again, I'm going to press enter, look on the right side here on the terminal for the output. When I press enter, never mind that it's frozen. It said there is an array, and the array has one big element in it, and it's an object. And that object has everything about Philip. Has name is Philip, job is professor, pet is cat. Good, so far so good. Let's do it for Carol now. I'm going to do Carol, and let's do that. And when we do the click on the visiting the Carol URL, it returns name Carol, job engineer, pet bear. And let's do John. And it's name John, job student, pet dog.jpg. And let's do invalid one. Very interesting. So if you have an invalid one, the rows will be an empty array. So this is actually important because now we know what happens when you pass in something invalid. Let's pass in another invalid name. Press enter, and rows is empty array. Okay, so that means, just like our code below, we want to check whether rows is valid. So if rows.length is greater than 0, which means it has more than one thing, we're going to do something else. We're going to do another thing. So what we're going to do when an error, remember how when there's an error, we failed and we return an empty object instead of undefined. And the reason why we return empty object is it just makes the error checking in the front end a bit easier because it will always be an object, whether it's empty or not. So we're going to copy this code. I'm just going to paste it in here, indent it, and oops, wrong place to paste. I'm going to paste it in the else clause. So in here, rows is a length is 0. So there's an error. And let's just test it first. So I'm going to save it and go back to our console. And now if you notice, we already did this automatically. If you notice, whenever you try to visit an invalid URL, any invalid URL, it will return you an empty object. So that is this code working. So what happens if you return a valid URL? If you go to valid URL, then what we're going to do is we're going to do res.send rows 0. So why do we do that? It's because we're assuming that there is only one row in the database that matches the name, or 0, right? Or 0 rows. So we're just taking the 0th element of the array, which is just taking off the outside. So this array has one element, and at index 0, because arrays are 0 indexed in JavaScript, is this thing. So when we say row 0, I'm simply taking out this object, or this object, or this object. So when I do that, I save, server restarts. Now when I go to users Philip, it will give me the information I want. It will give me the fact that my name is Philip, job professor, pet cat. Let's go to John. Whoops, I misspelled John, so it's empty. Okay, good test. John, student dog, and Carol, engineer bear. Good, so far so good. So now the cool thing is I can go back to my pets app. Let me reload it. And now, without changing anything about the front end, I have basically let it work in the exact same way. Philip, John, Carol. And some junk here. Cannot find it. So while this may not look very interesting because, this Pets app front end did the exact same thing as it did when I started this video, it's actually pretty interesting because I managed to refactor the entire backend. Let me just erase this code. So now the backend entirely uses an SQLite database called pets.db, and it does not use a fake database at all. So notice how here, this is the entire code for the server. There's no fake database anywhere in sight. It's all using the real pets.db database. So I've refactored the backend, and the reason why the front end didn't need to change at all is because these URLs are exactly the same. The front end is just calling the URLs via Ajax, so it's exactly the same. So it doesn't you don't actually have to change the front end code at all.